Hey everyone, I know it's been ages since I uploaded anything to this channel. It's just been super busy with work and writing and all of that other fun stuff. But I did just want to take a few minutes to talk about the Reason 11 update that dropped a little while ago. Now, as I'm sure some of you know, I've been working almost exclusively in Reason for a few years now. We produced and mixed the Zeta album with it, which, if you're not familiar, that's myself, my partner Casey, and Dan Tompkins of Tesseract. My new Chimp Spanner album is finally being written and recorded in it, and I've done at least a dozen albums for libraries such as Red Bull and the music library that I work for now, Alibi Music. And I'll drop a link to some of that in the description below so that you can hear kind of what I've been up to for the last few years, I guess. But if you're a long-time user of Logic, Cubase, Ableton, or any other DAW, you've probably just kind of been looking at the rack from afar, all the cool devices and wires and things, and just thinking, that'd be nice if I could bring that with me into my DAW of choice. And with Reason 11, you can actually do that, as it's now a VST and AU plugin. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how that works and why I think it's really cool for all the other producers and sound designers and composers out there. Now, if you're anything like me, you have a lot of plugins for a lot of different jobs. So in the case of something like Complete, some of the libraries are standalone instruments such as Battery, or they may be libraries within Kontakt, or reactor ensembles, and so on. And it can get kind of overwhelming and just difficult to know where to start looking for sounds. So the most exciting thing about the Reason Rack plugin for me, apart from the fact that I know it inside and out, is that I've now got one plugin that does pretty much every job that I need it to do. So here I'm using the Suite version, which is kind of the top tier edition of Reason 11. There's Intro, Standard, and Suite. And this really does just cover so much ground. There's drums, Rex players, wavetable synthesis, granular synthesis, subtractive and semi-modular, even kind of Moog-inspired monosynth. There's a hyper-sampled piano, romplers, human voices, samplers, more pianos, even a full-featured West Coast modular synth, which is right up there with some of the best standalone modular synth plugins I've used. So, it kind of just goes on and on. There's a whole bunch of stuff here, plus effects, and a whole bunch of different utility and MIDI effect devices as well, that I'm not going to go into in detail in this video, but just kind of skirt around and show you what's possible. So let's just take a look at how this works and at some of my favorite devices within the rack. So when you load the plugin, you have this empty rack and then some device suggestions to get you started. But here I'm just going to use the browser. So for instance, if I was going to start with drums, I could use something like the Kong Drum Designer. And I can either just click and drag things in or double click and they'll be added to the rack automatically. So from here I can either browse from the included patches, or I can browse through the factory drum sounds to build my own kit. I can also use the file browser in Cubase to drag samples directly from my hard disk into Kong as well. So of course from there you could do the sort of basic things you'd expect to do, so repitch the drum, change the decay, or alternatively I could go in and then replace this drum module with a drum synth. And then use the built-in effect modules to kind of design the sound a bit further. And there's a whole bunch of different modules, including kind of physical drum modeling as well. And I guess these are quite similar to what you would find in something like Machine. So you can build your own drum kit, completely from scratch, or you can just use samples, or you can use the built-in kits. Another really quick way to make drums is by using the Dr. Octarex. So this loads and triggers up to 8 Rex files, or sliced loops, and these can either play in sync with the sequencer, and you can automate this playback using host automation, so you can switch between up to 8 different loops or turn the loop on and off, and so on. Or you can also play these loops back like drum kits. So I would disable loop playback, and then I can just go in and design the shape of the amp envelope and apply different filtering and modulation. And I use this one a lot for things like breakbeats, hip-hop, anything where I kind of need that sliced and resampled sound. And obviously Reason comes with a whole bunch of these Rex loops, both percussive and melodic as well. Now for basic synth sounds, Reason really has all bases covered. So for instance, there's Monotone, which is kind of like a Moog-inspired monosynth with 2 oscillators that you can blend between and detune. It also has a noise generator, as well as frequency modulation, and a really fat filter section. Now for basic polyphonic subtractive synthesis, there's Thor. And Thor is really cool as it has these 3 oscillator slots that you can fill with different types of oscillator. So for instance, I could just do a basic 3 oscillator analog style polysynth. Or I could perhaps use the FM synthesis module, and then use the modulation matrix to assign the mod envelope to the amount of FM. And bonus points if you recognize that. So with this combination of modular oscillator types and also swappable filter types, in conjunction with the mod matrix, you can get some really cool sound design, as you can hear in some of these preset patches. So Thor and also the Subtractor, which was one of the first synths that came with Reason, these are really good kind of workhorse synths when you just need to do things like pads, simple plucks, basses, bells and stuff like that. But at the other end of the spectrum, we have more complex synths like Europa. Now Europa is part wavetable and part spectral. So by that I mean that it has various wavetables that you can scan through. And you can also control that scanning behavior using modulators. And you can even drag in your own samples and turn them into wavetables. So I would just select User Wave Smooth. And then I can apply and modulate up to 2 modifiers. So modifiers are things like sync, as well as wave shaping, and other effects such as unison and ensemble. And then on top of that, I can use spectral filtering and processing to just kind of shape that sound even further, but it's doing this on the level of waveforms rather than processing the audio. So it's kind of a technical distinction, but it allows for some really cool effects. There's also this really rich unison section, as well as a filter. And it has 3 of these engines, so you can have one that's doing a kind of normal analog sound, and then maybe another one that's doing all this kind of crazy spectral processing, and so on. But it also has a really powerful modulation section using these 4 envelopes and 3 LFOs. So let's say I wanted to create something simple like a riser. I could just draw in the shape of my envelope however I want it, and I would take envelope 1, drag it to the pitch, And then I can assign this modulator to any of the parameters that are here on the front panel. So for instance, I could control the amount of Unison detune. Or perhaps the amount of filter. So for sound design, you can see that it's just really quick and really easy to create those staple sort of bass sounds like risers and subdrops and so on. There's also a fantastic granular synth called Grain, and this lets you just stretch and granularize any sample into these kind of spacey, otherworldly sounds. So I have this music phrase from the Jungle Jungle sample pack. So again, I'll drag that from Cubase's file browser onto Grain. And then I can control how the grains are played back. So I could freeze them. And then apply some modulation to how the playhead moves. As well as choose different algorithms for how the sound is granularized. And again, it has that same powerful modulation section that's found in Europa, as well as a built-in effects section, which Europa also has. So you can get really crazy with these envelopes and use them to control things like the playhead position, as well as characteristics of the granular algorithm itself. So in this case, let's try assigning envelope 1 to the playhead position. And then I can just click and drag to add in new points. So it's going to scan through the sample using the shape that I define on the envelope. Then we've got synths like Parsec, which is an additive synth, and it's really great at creating harmonically interesting sounds. And it comes with a bunch of different waveforms, some of which you'll find in Thor as well. So we can start with something simple like this sawtooth. And then run it through 2 of these modifiers, or 4 of them if you were to chain these 2 generators together. So I can turn something like a sawtooth into a completely unrecognizable sound with just a couple of clicks. Now there's even, as I mentioned earlier, a fully featured West Coast modular synth, Complex 1, and I'm not even going to attempt to go into that in such a short space of time, but if I just go through a couple of presets, you'll see the kind of sounds that you can create with it. So this is almost like a rack within a rack, and that it has this front panel cabling. And it's in a similar kind of territory to other synths that you may have seen, such as Voltage Modular or Reactor Blocks, but all kind of within this self-contained package and all within the Reason rack. And then of course there are more traditional instruments such as the Radical Piano. And this models the full anatomy of a piano, so it gives you control over things like string resonance, as well as the sound of the hammers and sustain pedal. There's also a really solid drum rack instrument as well. So this allows you to kind of build your own drum kit out of various different multi-sampled drum pieces. And then of course we have things like the electric bass. And there's even a couple of variations of the classic Waldorf wave, one of which I actually did some presets for, so you can find them lurking in the Layers Wave Edition. Now, all of that on its own is pretty cool, and like I said, it's super useful to just be able to go to this one plugin for a bunch of different sounds, different synthesis techniques. But what really separates Reason from other plugins is the modularity of it. So, for instance, if you wanted to layer a piano with one of those Waldorf wave pads that I showed you just a second ago, you would just drag it in underneath that instrument, and then these two sounds are going to play together in unison. So sound layering, super simple. But you can also go a bit further than that, and you can put the devices into what's called a Combinator. So you'll see here that there's different classes of devices. There's instruments, which we've looked at some of them. There's effects, which is a whole other subject, but you can sort of process and affect the sound entirely within the rack. There's also these utility devices as well. So the Combinator is kind of like a container for various different instruments. So within that Combinator, I'll create a mini mixer, and then I can add my different layers in. So let's try a piano and one of these tuned percussion sounds. So the first advantage to this is that I can use the inline mixer to adjust the balance between the two instruments, as well as panning. But I could also then go ahead and process these with effects. So if I was to drag a reverb underneath the line mixer, that would then become a send effect. And then any effects that I put underneath the instruments are applied to them individually. I could even create key splits. So for instance, I have a Monotone and the Reason drum kits rack loaded in. Now, by default, they're just going to play at the same time, which sounds pretty goofy. But if I open the programmer, I then have control over the different layers within the Combinator, and you can adjust things like whether or not they receive MIDI, or pitch bend, aftertouch, mod wheel, and so on. So what I could do here is I could bring the key range of the drums down, and the key range of the bass up. And then we'll just apply some transpose to these drums so they're further down the keyboard. You can even use special MIDI processors called players to control the different layers in different ways based on the MIDI input of your keyboard. So this bass, for instance, is going to play an arpeggiator. The pads are going to play an auto chord. And then this kind of plucky sound is going to be using the auto chord going into an arpeggiator. There are also players for things like melodic step sequencing, as well as drum sequencing with note repeats and note probability. There's even this generative music player called the Quad Note Generator that uses a mix of Euclidean rhythms, scale quantization, and randomization to generate music on the fly. And of course, these are all chainable as well. So, for instance, I could add in a note echo that transposes up by an octave with each repeat. Now, speaking of chains, we've kind of touched on effects really briefly, but this is where the modularity of the Reason plugin really comes into its own. So a bit like the insert section of your DAW, effects can be chained in sequence by just dragging them underneath each other. And if you want to reorder, you can shift drag. So for instance, I could put this delay before the distortion. And this is cool as you can experiment with different effect orders to get different effects. Now obviously you could do this in any DAW, but where it gets really interesting is at the back of the rack. So if you hit tab, you can flip all of these devices around and see how they're connected. And you'll also notice that every device has these special inputs and outputs called CV. And these can be modulated by devices within the Reason rack. So there are devices within Reason called utilities, and these are great for controlling these CV connections. So for instance, I could take an LFO and then patch that into the frequency of the sweeper and also the decay time of a reverb. So even a simple setup like that would be quite time consuming to do just using host automation. You can also freely route audio in this way too. So you might want to process the left and right channels independently. So in this example, I'm going to hold shift while I drag effects in, and this will just prevent them from being automatically connected. So let's just try something like taking the left channel and going into distortion, and then the right channel and going into a reverb. Or in this example, I'm using the stereo imager to go into two separate effect chains for the low and the high bands. So the high band is going into a gated reverb and a compressor. While the lower band is going into distortion and a resonator that's going to modulate the frequency based on the volume coming into the effect. So this just allows you to get really inventive and creative with your effects routing beyond just putting things in serial connection. So obviously this is cool in the context of affecting rack instruments, but you can use these effects on any VST, as the rack plugin also works as an insert and a send effect. So in this example, I have Nucleus from Audio Imperia loaded into Contact. And then I've added the Reason rack plugin as an insert effect. And so here I can use Reason's modulation tools and effects to create all sorts of interesting movement within an otherwise ordinary sound. Now, obviously, this would work great as a live effects processor as well. There are SSL-inspired devices for dynamics and channel EQ, for instance. So you could design your own channel strip plugin. And then obviously, as I showed you before, you can experiment with the routing order, add additional devices, and so on. You could even use the Reason Rack plugin to build your own guitar effect processor or modeler. So here I'm using some third-party extensions from Kuasa, so a noise gate, an EQ, an overdrive pedal, an amp, and a channel strip EQ. And then I could expand this rig with all sorts of other third-party devices, modulating different parameters on different effects. So obviously this is just a really quick overview of the Reason Rack plugin. Now I'm still very much a Reason standalone user, but for those of you who are nicely settled into programs like Cubase or Logic, then this is going to expand your toolset pretty drastically. If you want to check out some detailed tutorials on how to use Reason, I have some videos over at groove3.com. You can also ask any questions down in the comments below, and I've included a link to find out more about the different editions, as well as how to demo the software. As I said earlier, this is all using Reason Suite at $599. Now if you break that down into the cost of each of these as separate plugins, it's pretty crazy, but there's also different options such as Intro at $99 and Standard at $399. They all come with different devices and effects, so just be sure to check that out on the comparison channel. Also, as I'm now set up to do video properly on my Mac, if you want to tell me what you'd like to see covered, I'll pick the most requested one for the next video, which will hopefully be soon.